Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you're a rotter, Peter, for finding that photograph, because my hair has changed colour since then. And that, by the way, that was my first election. I was from the Labour Party, standing in a very, very strong Conservative seat. So I knew that I had no chance myself. But it taught me a really interesting experience about how political sentiment can just change in the course of a few days. So this was an election called by the then Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath because of his concern about the miners' union and the way, in his view, they were holding the country to ransom. And he called it early, the election. And for 3 weeks of the 4 weeks of the campaign, in this deeply conservative area, I was getting doors slammed in my face, told to go home and all the rest of it. And then in the last week, it changed. And people started to welcome my presence on the doorstep. And when the result came out, Mr. Heath had lost his majority, had a majority of 50 in the Parliament. He had lost his majority, and the overall result was that Labour came to power at that time. The other great thing about that election was that at the count, the Liberal Democrat and I had a debate about which of us would come third. And I bet him £1, quite a lot of money in those days, that I would come third. And I'm pleased to say I took the pound off him. I came third by 18 votes. Now, I'm delighted to be back in Ghana when my hair was that colour. In fact, a few years before that, I made my first visit to Ghana in 1971. I came here as I was the then president of the National Union of Students, as part of a British delegation to the Commonwealth's Students' Conference that was held in Kumasi. I spent almost a week here and had a fantastic time. I remember the fantastic time. I remember some of the unchanging aspects of Ghana, as Mats was saying. I mean, the colour, the smiles, the laughter. I can't remember a great deal about the work we did, but by God, we had a terrific time, and I'm so pleased to be back. I'm also old enough to remember when Ghana became the first sub-Saharan country to gain its independence from colonial rule back in 1957. My parents had been strong supporters of the movement for colonial freedom, and although I was just 10 at the time, I can still remember my parents' delight that the United Kingdom was at last, in my parents' view, starting the process of ending imperial rule in Africa. Now, when I made that first visit to Ghana in 1971, Dr. Kofi Busia of the Progress Party was your president. But his period was sandwiched between various military governments. As your new president, Akufo-Addo, spelled out in his first address last month to the United Nations General Assembly, that was a period of, quotes, years of political turmoil and the accompanying economic chaos. Now, it's never been a surprise to me that almost all countries emerging from the yoke of rule by another country should have had some period of instability in their first decades of independence. Colonialism, by its nature, was the least democratic of any system of government. The culture of and institutions for democracy have typically taken not decades, but centuries to become established, as we in Europe ought to understand. I often used to sit round the table of the European Union and count up the number of countries around the table which had known democracy for longer than I had been alive. Not that many. In fact, a minority of countries in Europe, and I'm not just talking about Eastern Europe either, have known democracy in my lifetime. Now, what is really striking about Ghana is, again, to quote your President's speech to the United Nations General Assembly, is that a consensus has now emerged that in our Fourth Republic, Ghana has had political stability for the last 25 years under a multi-party democracy where regular elections are now an accepted feature of our governance. His Excellency added that Ghana continues to be a beacon of democracy and stability on the continent. Our institutions of state are growing stronger, and we've made more progress with our economy than at any time since independence. Now, two things are really noteworthy to me about this progress. One is the emphasis on education, with the commencement of the free senior high school program, guaranteeing secondary education for all free for all of Ghana's children. Now, again, it's not so long in the United Kingdom that secondary education of the highest standard to 18 was not free, except for a tiny handful of children. It wasn't free for my grandfather, so he had to leave school, a bright man, at the age of 13. And had the equivalent guarantee of completely free secondary education not been made in Britain in the closing stages of the Second World War, I would not be standing here as a former foreign minister of the United Kingdom. For I came from a low-income family, and I was the first generation of our family to benefit from free secondary education to university and onwards. You look around the world, and it's education which is fundamental key to prosperity and to social harmony. There's an interesting bit of European history here. In 1851, I can't remember that, so I didn't have any hair then. In 1851, Britain ran this great exhibition. We were dominating the world. We were the workshop of the world. We ran another one in 1867. By then, a degree of panic had set in Britain because Germany had come up the tracks and was competing so much with the United Kingdom. And what had happened in a relatively short space of time was that Germany had recognized, as it unified, absolute fundamental of decent, high quality, above all technical education. And it's from that base that Germany's position now as the engineering powerhouse of the world has been sustained. Now, the second thing of note for me in what your president said at the United Nations General Assembly was his determination to, quote, build an economy that is not dependent on charity and handouts, to build a Ghana beyond aid. It's an easier platform, he said, on which to build sustainable relationships. And one key way, of course, to build those sustainable relationships, to enhance economic growth and employment, is by an expansion of tourism. As we've heard today, Ghana is brilliantly placed to develop its tourist potential. You are a stable country. There are here what I would describe as ordinary levels of crime, similar to the levels which, for example, British citizens have to take account of when they're in Britain itself, with one important exception: the absence here, knock on wood, of terrorism. There is a risk of terrorism anywhere in the world. We in the United Kingdom have had to be living with that risk, not to say reality, for 50 years. I have a small scar on my backside, small now, which I got, it was a larger scar once, when I was caught up in a bomb blast at the Old Bailey Criminal Court in 1973. That was an Irish Republican Army bomb blast. But we've had much more recent terrible outrages, and we've had to learn to live with them. As your national security announced last year that it's taking enhanced measures to deal with the terrorist risk in response to the attacks in other countries, not least in the near neighborhood. But there has, as the United Kingdom Foreign Office Travel Advisory sets out, been, quotes, no recent history of terrorism in Ghana. I don't wish to tempt Providence by saying that, but it's true and is another very positive factor on which to develop a vibrant tourist industry. As important as reassurance about the negatives, safety and security, there are the huge positives for tourism to Ghana. Ghana ranks, according to the Forbes magazine, as the 11th most friendly country in the world and the most friendly in Africa. For the UK traveller, there's the shared language, a similar time zone, a shortish 6-hour flight, and a compatible legal system. For every traveller, there are beautiful beaches and countryside, a warm tropical climate all year round, diverse wildlife, exotic waterfalls, dozens of castles and forts, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and I heard from the minister last night, and crocodiles which eat chickens, but like human beings. Extraordinary. I've got the video and I'm going to show it to my grandchildren who won't believe it until I've shown it to them. But then there is the history. And we heard from Craig and Mats about tourism being about memories, and I'd add about connections. Now, some of the history here is shared with the United Kingdom and many other European countries. And the fact that your history for some centuries was in part dominated by Britain as the colonial ruler is the more reason for that history being better known in the UK, and one of the many advantages of a well-grounded experience for tourists from the UK and from Europe as a whole. But you also, unlike, I have to say, many countries I've been to whose history is much more recent, you've got this fantastic, rich history of your own, phenomenal rich history of your own, which is another added reason for making Ghana such an important destination. So you've got huge potential as a tourist destination, but potential is the appropriate word. 90,000 UK nationals visited Ghana last year. Sounds a lot, but given the propensity of Brits to travel, it's a small number. Just 1,800 a week, a few plane loads a week. You think about the number of Brits who go to Turkey, even over the last year or so with all the difficulties Turkey has had, well into the 1.5 million, and in a good year it's 2.5 million, and that's just from one European country. There's only one daily non-stop flight between the United Kingdom and Ghana. There are, as I discovered when I went online, quite a lot of cheap deals for travel here from the United Kingdom, but you've got to be, I think, young and determined to take part in these cheap deals, as they involve typically 2 or 3 transfers via other European countries and long waits. We heard from Catherine, the Minister, that last year about 1.2 million tourists came to Ghana, up a bit from a previous number of around 1 million. But the World Economic Forum statistics, albeit for 2010, show that out of the world's favorite tourist destinations, Ghana was ranked 108th out of 139. I've seen one report with the proposed in 2014 that by 2027, which is only 10 years away, Ghana should increase the number of international tourists by 4.3 million. I'm sure that that could be achieved, but it's important that some early collective and consensual decisions are made about the kind of tourism you wish to attract. Is it the luxury market, all the 5-star hotels, especially if the baby boom generation who are now replete with grey dollars, euros and pounds? Is it the package holiday market, highly competitive, and which areas like the Mediterranean coast of Spain have so popularized? Is it the backpack market? These are not, as we've heard from Mats and Craig, exclusive categories. Spain, a very large tourist market, manages to attract all the categories, but not in the same places. And I'm certain, we've heard this morning, there are many European and other travel companies who would be interested in investing here. But it takes planning and requires public investment alongside that which is attracted from private sources. But the rewards will be great from the additional foreign exchange, from the greater prominence given to Ghana, and from the increase in employment. And I thought the figures which Mats gave us about for every $1 million invested, the difference in the number of people you get if the money is invested in tourism compared to agriculture or to industry are really significant. In a world of increasing automation, service industries continue and will continue to have a high demand for labor at every skill level, including the lower skill levels. Automation inevitably means that in agriculture and industry, as you become more productive, jobs, especially at the lower skill levels, are lost, and that will go on. But there never will be a machine which can give a welcoming smile, a well-timed laugh. And it's welcoming smiles backed by efficient human service which can make the whole difference between hotels and resorts which do well and those which do not, can make the whole difference between whether the memory of a visit is a good one, which is passed on to family and friends and through social media, or whether it's a poor one. And you can't make a machine to do that. Now, one thing we've talked about today, but you'll excuse me for saying it's got to happen and you've got to do it quickly, is to change the way the visa system operates. I understand, having been Home Secretary in the United Kingdom, that countries of lower GDP are quite sensitive when countries of higher GDP, like the United Kingdom or Schengen countries, have to maintain quite a strict visa regime. So when I was Home Secretary, we had to do that. And the first reaction of the country at the other end is to go in for reciprocity. So if the United Kingdom has a tight visa regime, for example, with Turkey, Turkey will reciprocate and say, well, if Brits want to go to Turkey, they'll have to go through quite a complicated visa process too. Take the example of Turkey. It is still the case that you have a formal visa process if you're a Turkish citizen and you want to come to the UK, although we welcome a great many Turks. But Turkey, some years ago, changed its visa system because it wants Brits and others from Europe to go to Turkey in huge numbers. So you don't have any visa system, and you're advised to get an e-visa, but you don't need one. The carriers, the airlines, are not penalized if they allow somebody onto a plane who's not got a visa. And under laws which I'm afraid I strengthened, carriers can be fined typically £3,000, $3,500 US, if they take someone on a flight, either way, who's undocumented. You don't need a visa to get on a plane to Turkey, and if you've forgotten to buy a visa before you go, you pay €10 and you get one at the airport. So it works, and it's a reason why Turkey's been able, one of the many reasons, to encourage so many people to go to the country as a good destination. But as sadly, and I'm afraid this also applies to Turkey, the experience of some countries to the north of Sahara shows all too graphically, Whether tourism can be sustained depends in part on investment and good marketing, and by God it does on both of those, but above all on the destination being safe. I've already referred to the fact that Ghana is a safe country and that there have been no recent terrorist outrages here. But as I believe your National Security Council appreciated when it enhanced counter-terrorist measures 3 years ago, the more important tourism is to a country's economy, the more that it could be at risk from the evil people who direct international terrorist groups. So, yes, it's great there have been no tourist outrages, but you have to keep working and keep planning and putting the counter-terrorist structure in place to ensure that this country remains what it is today, a brilliantly safe place. You've also got a deal, and I found this morning absolutely fascinating, with some of the other issues that may make private investors think, well, you know, if we're choosing between this country and another, the numbers don't quite stack up here. As we heard from Mads and Craig, the fact that it costs per bed more here than to construct a hotel than it does in other countries who, on the face of it, will have higher labour costs. You've got to make the issue of land transfer, zoning, planning simple, and you've got to put in this extra public sector investment, because investors are not going to just dump even a wonderful hotel on a site which hasn't got proper communications, good sewage, reliable power supplies, and other things outside the area itself. But all of that can be done. There are plenty of examples, which we were heard this morning, where countries or parts of countries have started from zero and have built up their tourism to extraordinary heights today. Back in 1978, my wife and I took our honeymoon in India. Very intrepid thing to do in those days. We went to Goa, now an extraordinarily well-known destination. It was almost impossible to get to it, and there were tiny hotels. But from getting on for nothing, it is now one of the major destinations in that kind of market. Now, just say a couple of other things about the international climate, but I'll make them very briefly, and if there's time, I'm happy to take questions on virtually anything you like. International terrorism, mainly Islamic jihadist terrorism, is one of the factors which today makes for an uncertain world, which is not at peace with itself, literally and metaphorically. When the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States became the undisputed world power alone. We moved from being a bipolar world to a unipolar world, but that also had the benefit that suddenly, in place of standoff in the international community, cooperation in the United Nations and other international institutions started being the norm. One of the consequences of the Cold War was that the United Nations Security Council had been partially paralyzed from taking action. And so between 1946 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Security Council averaged just 15 Security Council resolutions a year. And it never got round to debating, for example, the war in Vietnam, because there was never going to be agreement. Since then, and the number of Security Council resolutions has quadrupled. It's gone up from 15 to 61 a year, which is an indication that there has been much more international collaboration than there could have been. But that kind of collaboration set back by 9/11, by decisions, yes, in which I participated, which led to greater divisions, not least over the Iraq War, and by big arguments about how to handle issues, especially in the Middle East, your not so far away neighbors in Libya, and particularly in Syria as well. So that's added to the uncertainty. But if you told me even 3 years ago that there'd be elected as President of the United States somebody who was known as a reality TV person, I would have told you to go and take a shower, or you've been drinking too much. But that's what has happened. The fact that it's also worth us remembering that President Trump was elected, notwithstanding the fact he got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, his rival. I just say, by the way, that if on this continent somebody had been declared president with 3 million fewer votes than his or her rival, Washington would have been the first to come out in utter condemnation of a rigged election. I leave you with that thought. Anyway, he's there. I wake up every morning thinking, yeah, he's there. I'd rather pull the blanket over my head. And he is there, and we've got to sort of manage our way through this next 3 or 4 years. The worry that I have is that obviously it's up to the Americans and the system they have as to what they do internally, but this is a very curious policy which is being pursued, where America is apparently trying to turn in on itself, becoming more protectionist, notwithstanding the fact that the last time protectionism was practiced by America, America was the greatest victim of that protectionism, even more than Europe. And that meanwhile, with a really hard issue like North Korea, and the North Koreans are indeed dangerous and deceitful and paranoid, the approach of President Trump appears to be one where he's threatening Armageddon rather than doing what he should be doing, and which is the only solution to dealing with that country, trying to provide it with a degree of security and working with the neighbors of China and Russia, Japan, and the South Koreans, who are only 20 miles away, Seoul 20 miles away from the 38th parallel, to reach a solution. And shortly, probably towards the end of this week, we may hear President Trump saying that he's going to tear up the deal with Iran, the nuclear deal with Iran. I was one of those people with my French and German counterparts who started the negotiations with Iran 14 years ago, 2003. They went by fits and starts. Initially, the United States was lukewarm about them, but later George W. Bush, to his great credit, changed his approach to those negotiations, joined in on them, and after further fits and starts, and thankfully the election of President Hassan Rouhani, we got a deal, 2015, endorsed by the US Congress and endorsed by the Security Council. It makes the world a safer place. It guarantees that Iran, even if it wants to, which I doubt, but even if it does want to, it can't and won't develop a nuclear weapon system for the next 15 years. It's a major prize, and this is something that President Trump is intent on tearing up. Extraordinary. And the last thing I just mentioned before coming back to tourism, which sometimes makes me feel that what I'd like to do is to flee from Britain with my family and settle here in Ghana, is the decision, albeit by a genuine majority, but small, of the United Kingdom electorate to decide it wants to leave the European Union. Brexit, as it's called. The European Union is not perfect. Any of us who've had to work in the European Union know that. No political institutions are perfect. So in my view, it's better than the alternative, and it's produced huge benefits for Europe, including for the United Kingdom, despite all its irritations, because it's really irritating trying to negotiate with other countries who've got independent views. It's very irritating. They wouldn't always do what Britain wanted them to do, and I found that aggravating sometimes, but the same was true for France and Germany and even and the small countries. But what I felt was this was a far better way of trying to make progress in Europe than the way we used to do it, which is by killing each other in larger numbers than on any other continent in the world. But we were given this choice. People chose between the European Union they know and some fantasy land, which is not going to be achieved, where apparently at one breath we would be free to trade with anybody in the world, and in the words of the current Foreign Secretary, people could, quote, have their cake and eat it. Well, it ain't going to be like that, but it's going to be difficult on the way to a final negotiation. One common and unpleasant thread in British politics last year, in much European politics, including in Germany, France, Austria, and in America, is the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. We saw that in the Brexit referendum. I know, having had responsibility for migration policy as Home Secretary for 4 years, how difficult this dossier is, how hard it is to balance competing interests. But I also know how Britain has hugely benefited from the contribution of new residents, some of which have been now for 3 or 4 generations, whether from the EU or much more significantly from Commonwealth nations. My former constituency, which I served for 36 years, is in North East Lancashire, now has about a third of its population whose families came originally from India and Pakistan. I used to do open-air meetings in the town centre, and sometimes people would say to me, "Why are they here?" referring to people who are standing alongside them who happen to have a different colour skin but same accents as them, whose family, fathers or grandfathers, came from India and Pakistan. So I said, well, they didn't just, in a nice warm country, pick a map and put a pin in it and say we're going to go to Blackburn, which is known above all for high rainfall and a cold, chilly climate. Why would you do that? I said the reason they're here is because we, British white mill owners, invited their fathers and grandfathers here when the mill owners couldn't get white workers to work in the mills for the wages the mill owners were willing to pay in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the other thing I said, and this applies to West Africa, to Ghana as well, you might not be here at all had it not been for the fact that their fathers and grandfathers, as so many did from West Africa, fought not for themselves, but for our safety and security, and to be able to live in the First and Second World Wars. So we need to welcome them, not go on with the abuse you've just come out with. Now, my people from the South Asian subcontinent make a profound and positive impact on the area's prosperity. Elsewhere across the United Kingdom, to people whose families hailed from West Africa, and not least from Ghana. Your diaspora in the United Kingdom is an enormous asset for Ghana. In every part of the UK, you have ambassadors and enthusiasts for your country. There is huge goodwill across the UK for this country, for its manifold strengths, for its beauty, and for its safety in a troubled world. The challenge now, through your tourism strategy, is to ensure that many more Brits and Europeans and Americans begin to savour those delights in Ghana, which up to now, you've rather made a secret. I know Ghanaians love Ghana. You've got this wonderful, exuberant self-confidence, but you keep it to yourselves. You're very secretive about it. You don't mean to, but you are. Share it. Tell the world about it, and you'll become one of the greatest tourist destinations in the international community. Thank you very much.